thank you. My name is Gundars Oswald. I'm the program chair for the Chesapeake chapter. We've got two presenters that are going to, of course, you all know why you're here. They're going to be talking about infrastructure protection and EMP. One of the interesting things is on the way in, and I'm sure a bunch of you guys grabbed these documents. There are two documents that are written by APL. One is on EMP and one on future implications of cyber civil wars. So I think, you know, we've got some speakers that are really relevant to the problems that we have today. First, we're going to have Mark, and he's going to talk about infrastructure protection, and then we're going to have Chuck Manta talk about the EMP areas, which are basically the two areas in these books, and also they're also part of the Incose International Committee in this area. We're going to split the time, and I'm going to be watching the time closely because we don't want to overrun it, but we will have about 15 minutes at the end to ask questions. And of course, after we close, you can stay around and talk to the presenters and so on. So thank you. Mark, you got your microphone turned on?
I think so.
Okay.
Everybody hear me? Okay. Okay, thank you for coming. I hope this is going to be an interesting presentation for everybody. What I'm going to be doing is giving a kind of a quick overview of the Incose CIPR, Critical Infrastructure Protection and Recovery Working Group, and what we've been doing. And then Chuck is going to go over the EMP SIG, which is he's a chairman for InfraGard, and what they're doing related. And we're working very closely together. Actually, Chuck actually got me into this actually almost a year and a half ago, I guess now. So anyhow, I got about 19 charts, so I'm going to have to zoom through these pretty quickly. But if you have any questions, we'll start answering at the end of Chuck's presentation. Okay. So what we're all about. Oh, okay. Okay, good. Okay, so what we're all about is what's referred to as low probability, but very high impact threats. And low probability doesn't mean that they don't exist at all, because they definitely do. These things will definitely be happening. Some level of this we already know about. The focus initially is on the power grid, but really everything, the other infrastructures that we have, and I'll go into exactly what they are also impacted that for multiple reasons, both power as well as other reasons besides that. Oops. There we go. Okay, I'm going to quickly go over the three threats. Solar is obviously one of them. And we're talking about anything that will knock out the power grid for over a month. So you start thinking about what is really critical when you start looking at how would we survive without power for over a month. And we're talking into a year to 2 years. And there's a lot of real serious issues related to this kind of a threat. So that's what all three of them are all about. This is obviously the solar one. And obviously when the Earth is in the orbit, that's going to be hit by one of the coronal mass ejections from the sun, is what this chart's all about. And obviously our northern lights, the auroras, really light up when some of these things happen, and they happen continuously. There's multiple levels of these, but I won't be able to get much into any of these in detail, but we can always talk about them a lot more later. Okay, second one is related to EMP. It's called a high altitude EMP, HEMP. The diagram on the, or picture on the left is the one that relates to the 1962 explosion that the United States did when they actually realized that this EMP problem existed. It knocked out the electric in Hawaii at that time. The diagram on the right kind of gives a perspective of what would happen if one was a high altitude EMP was ignited over the United States, and what the threat will be United States wide. And it doesn't have to be even as big as the one that they're talking about here. It could be even smaller and focus in certain areas. It could be, and we'll talk more about that briefly in a little bit. This, I left this in because Ambassador James Woolley was, not only wrote this article with Peter Pry, who's very well known in the EMP world as what's going on with this, but he also was at our, just last month, at the SEDC in Washington, and actually I had a chance to talk to him. He was a keynote speaker also. Chuck might have had a chance to talk to him also, and anybody else who was down there. But fundamentally, he's very concerned with this because of North Korea, which we all know about the problem we're seeing with what they're doing. But the key point here is that Scuds can actually launch a nuclear off of a freighter, and there's some discussion about that. They actually found a freighter that was from North Korea going through the Panama Canal. They thought drugs were on it. Turned out they actually had these Scud launchers on it. And so you start realizing how vulnerable we are to this kind of a threat. Okay, this one, if you want to do it, you can cut off a little bit here, but NORS, if you want to look at this, but this is kind of the diagrams they come up with to identify the cyber attacks that are happening over certain periods of time. I'm not sure what the actual duration period is, but it shows, and up here, right here is who's getting attacked, and the blue, even though you can't read it, is the United States. There's like 900 attacks happening over whatever period of time they're talking about right here. So anyhow, it's really interesting. If you want to do a search on NORS, NORSC, you'll find a lot of these different type of diagrams. So as we know, we're getting seriously attacked by the cyber issues, the cyber attackers. Okay, so anyhow, I'm going to get a little bit into infrastructures themselves. This diagram I put together when I was talking to Chuck, and we got talking about this, like a very high level context diagram. And just a couple key points that are actually in the diagram is the U.S. Presidential Directive 21 is the one document that lists the 16 critical infrastructures for the United States, and all of these apply to other countries besides us. And of course, you got the drivers, including some things like this, the National Space Weather Strategy, and other information is coming out here. And I'll talk about one meeting that's going to come up pretty soon. And of course, these are threats and some other information related to that. But I wanted to concentrate on this area a little bit more. Even though the power is one of the 16 critical infrastructures, and you consider all the systems that relate to all of these 16 infrastructures, there's another area that hasn't been addressed too well, and that's the overarching governance of these. And that gets to the agencies and the other government organizations, plus companies and others that actually need to be watching what's happening with all of these infrastructures, not only just power. So this is one area I think we can really be involved in more, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. Okay, so this is a diagram comes out of the FCC, and they show 8 of the 16 infrastructures, just a little notional diagram, but it shows like power, energy here, and its relationship to the other infrastructures. And of course, it relates really to, there's a couple of missing lines here, but this is one of the diagrams I think we really have to focus on in our architecture modeling, is figuring out what is the relationships going on between power as well as all the other 15 infrastructures, and all the relationships that are going on between those. So that's one of the things we're going to be starting to talk about, and I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. Okay, this is the list of the domains, if you want to, and they're alphabetically ordered, but chemical, commercial facilities, communications, dams is kind of separated out from water. There's also water and distribution of waste. So anyhow, that's the full list of the ones that are in the President Directive 21, and what we're concerned with for the CIPR, Incose CIPR Working Group. So if you get an idea, you know, health is obviously a very concerned, medical, information technology itself, nuclear reactors. So as you can see, this is a really seriously long and very complicated issue. How do you not only develop the individual architectures and other requirements, we want to get a little bit more into that area, and also how they interrelate to each other. So this is a phenomenally complex system of systems problem, is what it comes down to. Okay, so the CIPR working group that we started, we just actually got chartered a year ago in July. So we've only been in existence less than a year right now. As far as the charter, we started a little bit before that. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is be a focus for this problem that we're trying to address. And applying system engineering principles and practices that we have, the expertise so many of us in Incose can provide to help understand what the problem is, in addition to working towards solutions or better understanding of what it is, and working with others that need the kind of experience and expertise that we can provide. So that's in effect what we're trying to address. In addition, we're also looking at creating and distributing information. I got another chart. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that topic in another couple of charts from now. But anyhow, we're basically trying to be a focus for Incose, as well as trying to be an interface to, like Chuck's, Manto's EMP SIG and the InfraGard, which is an FBI organization, and help work with them where we can, and where we can provide information for them. Okay, so fundamentally, this is kind of a long list of the challenges that we're facing. This, as I mentioned, a very big problem, but we're looking at what is the critical infrastructure domains themselves, understand each one. Secondly, is cross interrelationships between these. I mentioned that. What are the actual threats? And even though there seems like there's some overlap between like solar as well as the EMP, they're also different. So you have to really look at each one to understand what is the impact for each one of them, because there's multiple levels of when you get into those. Cooperation across the domains, information and infrastructure technology applications. So, you know, long story short is we're trying to look at Incose really looking at a real world problem. And this is obviously a very serious problem that we're looking at for the world, in addition to the United States. And how can we provide engineering? So this is a little bit different than what Incose is typically used to. It's more, we've been always focused a lot more on the specific application of system engineering. I'm going to need some water. Okay, so anyhow, we're looking at various kind of products, obviously modeling, and I'm going to talk a little more about that. Sorry. We're already talking about articles. We're actually producing some already. I have one area I want to really get into is requirements. I can't do it here, but we really have to be able to start establishing high-level requirements that relate to each one of these threats, and start looking at how interfaces can be as requirements for interfaces, requirements for the actual infrastructure and domains, and other themes. So when you start thinking about system engineering, there's a lot of things that we can actually apply to this problem. References, we're doing that already. We're actually track and themes. I'll actually mention that in a minute here, related to conferences. Okay, this is a diagram that we use to kind of show us and our relationship within Incose. We have not only the working groups, we also have the leadership. Gary Rodler is very interested and involved in this. Dave Long has been involved already. We got several other countries involved. Europe. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. So the regions, like we have Australia involved, UK, Scandinavia, Europe, and other countries involved, in addition to the organizations that we're also being involved with. Nuts.
How does the those organizational relationships work?
Okay, IEEE, for one example, we're working not directly with them right now, but they are overlapping with the standards that we're looking at. The one I'm thinking of right now is OMG. OMG is working on some standards also that we are related to threat and risk. And we're also got an ISA, which is another organization developing ISA 99 standards that are related to infrastructure control systems like SCADAs. So we're just starting that right now. We got one lady, Charlotte Farmer, who is kind of our contact along with Ken Capture, that's working that right now. So we're just starting to get those relationships going. We've got a ways to go to get more of that. So this is more focused on the US. So in addition to what we kind of showed over here, InfraGard, and that's what Chuck's going to be addressing here pretty soon. Obviously, the government agencies, there's a lot more than just even on that list. This is the one I want to talk about related to us here in Maryland. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but basically getting directly connected with Maryland and the agencies and organizations here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, so here's like the Incose working groups. Give you an idea. These are the ones we've already got involved with us all directly. And these are others that we're just thinking we're all obviously can definitely think of being involved with us. So there's a lot going on already just within the last year. These are the events that we've had just recently. The Energy Tech happened in Cleveland just in November. We quickly came back and went to a meeting that Chuck Manoa had arranged for 2 days in DC. Sorry about this. We had the IW, had a lot of meetings going on there. The SCDC, that was the theme was CIPR. There was around 34 to 38 presentations just on critical infrastructure related, and that was just last month, actually part of this month. But what we have coming up is, for example, on 27th in Colorado is a space weather, and Chuck's directly involved in that one. Maybe we'll talk more about that. We got the Incose symposium, and we have a couple of meetings set up over there. We're going to have another Energy Tech conference in Cleveland again on the 21st of October. Chuck will be running another DuPont Circle meeting that like the one we went to last year, that the InfraGard and FBI are at, and other congressmen show up at, and stuff like that. These last two are more technical projects. This one is the one that the InfraGard is leading. They're developing a very detailed guide for resilience. And the last one is the Incose Insight. Let me just hit that one next on the next chart here. We actually, it's going to be the theme for the Insight for the December issue. CIPR is going to be the topic. Right now we have 16 abstracts we have submitted. We really were expecting 10 to 12. So we got to figure out how we're going to handle that many, because they're all really good topics, addressing a fairly broad spectrum of things. The thing I'd like to talk about for us here is we're looking for help, obviously, for somebody to be like a key point of contact to start working more of our local activities. And so I'll be looking for anybody that's interested in trying to take that position. Also working with the regional, that's Steve Dam out of Virginia is our region lead, and working with other chapters like Maryland, the DC chapter, and then Southern Maryland. In addition to outside of our organization, obviously FBI, InfraGard, they're all important for our main primary connection. And these are some of the organizations I was just mentioning that we're starting to work with already. We'll be obviously working with more organizations. So the one thing I want to quickly mention is that John McCarthy, who's here, has volunteered to be kind of a lead for us in the Maryland for creating an architecture and modeling. And John Yohaz, he's a co-chair of the CIPR working group with myself and Mike Del Mare, but he's a power guy. He's the one running the power conferences. So they'll be focusing on the power architecture. I'm going to be involved mainly from the USM point of view of the process of implementing model-based system engineering. And I also want to, after we get power kind of under control, start working on a communications architecture and then start talking about interrelationship between those. So that's our thoughts there. And so John's going to be coming out with something pretty soon here. He's got a hard copy of something I got to look at here in a few days here. Okay, and also the Chesapeake chapter ESEP. Dave's going to have a meeting this weekend. We're hoping to get something going on there. And I want to mention the Woods Church, which actually Chuck and I, and that's how we got into this. There's another guy who's very involved in FEMA. Actually the husband of our minister. but he's very involved in FEMA and goes throughout the country for disasters. It turns out Presbyterian Church has a disaster recovery plan, so we're looking at implementing it at our church in addition to the community, and we're starting to look at potentially implementing a microgrid for power backup and doing some things like that. Okay, I'm going to stop right now. I'm probably a little over, so Chuck can kind of get through his presentation, and then we'll take questions after Chuck's done.
Which is the advancer? Exactly. Green laser to shoot down airplanes. I have a microphone, and he's turning it on. Great. I would sometimes think that if I talk twice as fast out of both sides of my mouth, you can get 4 times the data. But I don't know if people can listen that fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight some slides, focus on 2 or 3 primarily. You'll see more slides and we'll have time to discuss, just so you know the information's there for you to indulge in at a later time. So I wanted to make certain we talked a little bit about the purpose of the EMP SIG and what it's about, and focus briefly on why Incose is needed from my point of view, and then go through some examples of some of these high impact threats and what you might do in the way of planning and so on. First of all, I should just mention who InfraGard is, or what InfraGard is, and what the EMP SIG is. How many of you know what InfraGard is? A few of you, okay. So back in '96, the FBI was working with some folks who wanted to look at some infrastructure security issues, and they realized that they weren't sure they could talk about something like that unless they cleared everyone first. So they formed this activity that later became an organization. It's a 501c3 association of people just like yourselves. Anyone in critical infrastructure of any kind, from communications to power, healthcare, to farming, qualify. What you wind up doing if you choose to join it, you go to the website infragard.org and sign up. It takes a few minutes to go through the forms. It takes a couple of months for them to vet you, because they actually give you a background check from the FBI. And you sign non-disclosure agreements so that if you were to get law enforcement sensitive information, you're agreeing not to post it on your website. This is really important because there's not a place in the country where people who are not cleared can have a confidential discussion with at least baby teeth in it. And so you don't really get a secret clearance, but it's the closest thing we have to a civilian clearance. And there's over 40,000 active people across the country with this kind of a background check and a commitment to keep that quiet, so that when you have serious issues, you can trust the people to some degree across the table. What we did in 2011, we formed a focus group, they call them special interest groups, to look at any kind of threat that could impact critical infrastructure nationwide for more than a month. We call it the Electromagnetic Pulse Special Interest Group because EMP is the poster child of a bad day, but it could be space weather, it could be cyber, coordinated physical attacks, pandemics, any combination of the two, maybe my gym shoes, any weapon of mass destruction probably fits the bill. So we also call this the Every Major Problem Special Interest Group. And since our beginning, we've been looking at these things. We started in July of 2011, and we were able to instigate the first ever planning exercise of the US Defense Department through the National Defense University and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab right here in October 2011. The first time planning was done to look at a nationwide collapse of infrastructure due to something other than global war. Up until then, all they did was look at regional problems. The guy says, I just blew up your power station. If you don't give me some money, I'm going to do another 9. They did that, but they didn't do anything nationally. And that's really important, and I'll mention that in just a little while. You'll see me brief through some slides that show that every year since then, we pulled top technology and policy experts to get them in the room together to talk about these issues. And we have an annual conference proceedings. This most recent one includes the CIPR documents he discussed, but we try to capture a number of key documents that you might find difficult to acquire. And every book is somewhere between 20 to 100 books. You can get it from Amazon for about 20 bucks each, but you can go to your CIPR officials here and get them for $15 each, because they get them for 10 and put $5 in their pockets, or in your pockets, I should say. So our whole purpose in this is to bring top experts like yourselves together to look at these issues and try to figure out, what do we do about them? Milestones, I touched briefly on them. We're doing something next week. If any of you need an excuse to go to Colorado, they do the annual space weather workshop there. We're going to have somebody from the White House talk about the new space weather strategy, which I'll talk about in a moment. That's one of the key things I'd like to highlight, and how that's going to impact you. This is the after action report from the Defense or National Defense University, other things related to that. These are the books I was telling you about, except Ted Koppel's just a throw in. That has nothing to do with us, except that he talks about the topic. Again, we're an all hazards approach. The goal is to focus on local sustainability. And what you'll find when you look at these high impact threats, and there'll be a slide on this, it's qualitatively different from your normal disaster. When you have a Katrina, the rest of the country can come to your aid. But what happens if the rest of the country is going through their own Katrina at the same time? Then all bets are off, and things begin to unravel very quickly. That's why these are qualitatively different. And when you start working through that kind of a problem, you begin to realize we're not going to do very well unless we change up how we do society. We have to learn how to become more resilient locally to be in a better place. And I think this is a way to make it very compelling. And I want to go to two things that happened this last year that are game changers over the last 44 years. So I'm going to flip through some slides quickly to get to those. These are basically saying we only look at the little disasters and not the big ones. At the National Defense University, we basically categorized them this way. This was at also, I'm sorry, at the U.S. Army War College prior to the National Defense University meeting. When you have a couple of FEMA regions impacted, they would call that a Category 1 disaster. A Category 4 disaster would be something like the U.S. Civil War. We're devastated as a country pretty much, but after it's all over, we pick ourselves up again and we continue. Category 5 is the day after you pick yourselves up, new normal, new country, new everything, different day. We don't talk about 5s or 4s or even 3s, barely 2s. What we're talking about with high impact threats can range from a 1 to a 5, and they're qualitatively different. That's why we need Incose. You guys, what I understand you do, you make the really complicated manageable and simple enough for your layman in charge, the CEO, to figure out what's going on so that he could explain it to Wall Street. When I ran, for example, operations for complex telecommunications activities, the only way I was able to do massive amounts of stuff in really short time is that I had very elaborate business process engineering going on and very aggressive project management going on, and blended the two together. Most companies and most people did not want to do that. We got like 10 to 100 times more stuff done in the same amount of time as the people refused to do that. And I could tell you now that's already been in the trade press that utilities and other executives would refuse free gifts of technology offered by the Defense Department saying, we need you to operate, we're concerned about this cyber threat, we'll give you this equipment for free to make certain that your company and your substations continue to operate so we at the base don't fall apart and die. Just take it, we'll pay for it. And the person would say, I'm sorry, I can't take your gift. Why not? Well, because if we do that, we have to admit we're really important. And if we admit that we're really important and we're critical infrastructure, we become liable for all these extra business processes that we have to engage in to do all of this formal reporting. And it makes life too complicated for us, and we don't want to do that if we don't have to. And it's the same problem many of you, I'm sure, face all the time as Incose people. People, instead of trying to manage the complexity and make it simpler so you could make more money, get to market quicker, not lose so much money, some people would just prefer not to do all that work and suffer the consequences. Well, in this case, it's not even a company going down or utility that gets behind the times. It could be whether or not the country survives. You already saw slides about space weather. Space weather is not a low probability high impact event. It's a low frequency high impact event. 100% likely, just depends on the time. The kind that could result in a continental wide collapse, somewhere between 5 to 10% in a decade. This is the, similar to the slide you saw, line of sight depending on the altitude of an EMP attack. Those are the styles or types of EMP from the standpoint of the frequency. It's basically a broadband attack. We're not going to go into that. One thing to mention, though, there are some myths that need to be worked through for people. You don't necessarily need a large nuclear weapon to make this work. All you need is a lot of gamma rays. And when it detonates high in the atmosphere, the gamma hits molecules, hits the molecules, splits off the electrons, come raining down on Earth. 5 to 10 kilotons are plenty, especially for a regional hit. Something 80 miles high over Pennsylvania can impact from, say, Boston to Atlanta to Chicago, and when you look at those maps. Many people think that this shouldn't be our problem, the military will deter it. Even the military does not believe they can deter it. That's why they EMP hardened their most important strategic response capabilities. The only way to protect against EMP is to sort of harden the critical infrastructure. Now, I'm going to skip some of this except to, by the way, there's IEEE standards about drive-by EMP. There's a small, basically arms race on drive-by electromagnetic weapons. Boeing brags about it in the Champ. You probably know about that. Russians bragged about it by zapping one of our destroyers off the coast of Crimea a few months back, daring us to do something. We couldn't do anything because all our electronics were disabled. I'm going to skip some of these slides that show you how you can cause an EMP. This is a critical MilSpec showing how you can protect against it. It's an open source item. Pointing out one issue here, we did an economic impact assessment of EMP on a regional economy, looking at every SIC code. The key takeaway is when we looked at low, medium, and high impact events, if you picked out the right 10% of critical infrastructure, you can avoid 85% of the economic loss. Here's what I wanted to get to. Two things that happened differently over the last 44 years. And when I would talk to folks like General Honore, and I'm going to try to wrap this up in like about a minute if I can, he would say there's an unwritten rule that every president has. You do not get the American people panicky. It's bad for the economy and it's bad for elections. And the result of that is we have this message that is played since the demise of the civil defense program in the 60s, and it works like this. You're an American. Nothing in the universe can touch you where my guys aren't going to come rescue you by day 4. So you have 3 days of food and water so you don't get too uncomfortable, but don't you worry, we got you covered. And now, with the new space weather strategy, they basically say those bets are off. We may not be there for 40 days. We may not be there for 400 days. And immediately after they announced that, we basically had the Defense Department say the same thing. Because of advances of electromagnetic weaponry, we could lose the power grid not only for weeks or months, but perhaps permanently. So they came out with an RFP through the Small Business Innovation Research Program saying, we want to come up with EMP protected microgrids for things both on base and off the base, or our bases may no longer function. So skipping that, through all of that, this is what's causing this new doctrine to come out that says we need to be more resilient. This is why we need folks like yourselves to get involved. It's free to join InfraGard. We in industry need your leadership so that people don't throw their hands up in horror and say this is too complicated or give me a bullet now. You can tell them, we can help you understand and model the relationships between these infrastructures. We can help you model what might be better if you changed how you planned infrastructure, like how you would do things, how it would look if you did things differently. And I'll close with this, is that inadvertently as a society, we've come to probably the most dangerous time in recent history. because we have inadvertently maximized efficiency by minimizing resiliency. And the only way we're going to make it is if we reverse that and become more locally resilient and get back into some 80-20 balance instead of having all our eggs in giant technology baskets. But to get from here to there, we're going to need help from people like yourselves. And thank you.
Thank you, Chuck and Mark. We're going to have questions and answers now for the next 15 minutes. We would like for you to take a microphone. We've got two that we can pass
You need us
around.
to stay up front?
Yeah, I want
Okay.
to stay up front. Because we are recording this, and remember that you can go back on our website and you can listen to the recording again, and we'll have the slides up there too. I'm going to start out with the first question. I was working for ComSat Labs about 20 years ago, and one of the things that they had to do, they had to harden their satellite equipment when they're 23,000 miles out, and that took years of the chips had to be special chips, and the manufacturer had to do special things and everything. Now let's compare that to our cell phones, to our cars. How are we going to harden those kind of things when they change every few months? And to harden a piece of equipment takes literally years. I know that you can harden maybe a controller for a power station, but how are you going to harden all the cell phones?
It's a very good, you want me to take a
Go
shot
ahead,
at that?
yes.
Okay. So you try to cheat, not really. But what you do is, there's a few things that you can do. And that's why you have to take the systems approach to it. One thing, when you talk about control systems, the military has decided, because of that very problem, to come up with a concept of like a room. So if you had an 8 by a 20-foot room for your controls, if you had that space EMP protected, anything you put in there, even though it wasn't designed to be EMP protected, could be, as long as you shielded the 6 surfaces and all the conductive penetrations and made certain all the air going through went through waveguides. And so you can do that at the small level as well as the room size level, and sprinkle that around infrastructure nationally. That same methodology is being adopted by the Air Force and the Navy as they're beginning to do or revise their EMP codes, because they got the same kind of problem. They have a lot of things, they want to minimize weight, and they realize that certain things will be changing quite a bit. So you try to think through all those issues. How do you maximize the ability to cope with change and minimize the cost of doing the EMP protection?
Right, and we've had the same situation here at the government where we have radio protection, protecting from radio waves. And what you do is you put a radio transmitter inside the enclosure, and then you can walk around and make sure that, you're not, signal is going out there. Now, how do you check an EMP enclosure?
Yeah, so there are companies that the Defense Department uses who adopt these MIL standards. The MIL standards show you the testing techniques that they believe are valid. And as we begin to move into the civilian world, I propose that we have a civilian EMP rating system that works with all the objective measurement standards the military has done over the last 40 years, but use something like the Uptime Institute uses for the protection of data centers. The more resilient you are, the higher rating you get. We could create a tiered methodology that uses the objective standards so that you could have radiated and conducted pulses adequately protected, but in a way that's easier for the layman to understand.
But you're still only, making sure the power station's working. All the cars are going to be shut down. All the cell phones are going to be dead.
Yeah. So what happens is, another thing I should mention is that it's a probability game. This is a fuzzy logic stochastic. Is that kind of a problem? Is the right name for it? So this is very vulnerable, but it's a small target. If I hold it this way and use the EMP source, I'm more likely to get hit, less likely to get hit, even less likely to get hit. But if I'm like 2 meters in length, that's a really nice size for a lot of frequencies to hit me. And if I'm connected to wires, those wires are like antenna and make it even easier. So this might be a 3% chance that, even though it's vulnerable, would be lost in any given EMP event, but the cell tower might be a 30% hit. And even in the case of space weather, which does not have that E1 pulse in nanoseconds and picoseconds and so on, eventually if the grid falls apart, when you run out of fuel after 3 days and everything starts to fail, then you have gradual degradation too. So these are somewhat complex problems, but they're relatively straightforward approaches to it. And that's why, again, you guys are needed, because you understand complex issues and how to simplify them.
Right, and that's one thing that Mark can work on and actually simulate some of these situations, because like you were saying, that not all the cell phones are going to be dead, but if the cell towers are dead because they ran out of fuel, that's another situation. Can you get a truck over there? But the truck is dead because the motor got knocked out, the electronics got knocked out because of the EMP pulse. So, so I think I've had enough questions here. Let's try somebody else.
I just like just a couple quick comments related to that too. That's part of the reason why I think we have to analyze every one of these individual, at least the three and the subsets of each one of those, as to how they can impact on the power grid as well as any of the other components in cars, phones, whatever else it may be, because it's a very complex and very big technical challenge to understand what are all the impacts. And as one simple example that I think about, I read this somewhere, is that a metal garbage can can be in effect a small version of a Faraday cage. Of course, you have to protect against the walls, right? So you could put a couple things into that, apparently. And I don't know the details of how well that works, but that's the kind of thing we could start looking into. The other one is the microgrids, which we were talking about for our church, which run their DC, 24 volt typically, or something on that order, that are backups to if we did lose power, so the solar or whatever else you might be using for that. But in addition, you could actually use it during the day of a normal day and actually maybe reduce your electrical power costs. So there's things like that you can start to look about and think about doing that will not only work from a larger facility, but also individual homes, communities, and working together. And they're already doing this, like North Carolina's doing some work related to a community being developed that's kind of like can be off the grid. You may have heard off the grid type of things. That's kind of approaches to actually having a backup capability besides being connected to the grid. Okay.
Question here. You talk about critical infrastructure. I'm wondering what an example of non-critical infrastructure might be.
Well, sometimes even critical infrastructure that may not be important to this conversation are monuments. Some people might consider that critical, but not for this. The best way, I think, to think about it is what's important to you. For example, right now, the Defense Department has just issued this request for proposal saying, we need to make certain that the bases stay alive, or defense critical infrastructure. Because out of 100 things a base may do, there's 5 or 10 or 15 things that are absolutely essential. We have to make certain they work. But the problem they have is that a lot of the things they need to survive don't emanate from within the base. It's the water and the sewer and the hospital services that come from 5 miles away. It's not enough for you to define what you think is important that you own and operate, but what you depend on from other people that we usually take for granted. So if every military base, for example, or defense critical infrastructure, or this facility right here, ask that question, say, what are the 3 to 5 things we need? So if the grid were to be gone everywhere for a year, just to make it simple, not that it's going to necessarily be that bad, but to make it simple, nationwide power outage for a year, what do I need to survive? Ask that question of yourself, and the answers you come up with is that answer. So it'll become things that you might not even think about, like even food and water. And that becomes a problem because most people don't realize we no longer have a strategic grain reserve in this country. If there was a big food shortage, we can't go to a big stockpile of grain and dole out the food anymore. And because we stopped having a strategic grain reserve in this country, no other country in the world has developed one. So now when 50 million people start to die somewhere, there's no place in the world to go get the food to feed them. It doesn't matter how much money you have. So that's a very good question. And one question it's like an onion. You start asking the first question, then you get the next question, then the next question.
I got another thought that's actually really more of another, I guess I'll call it critical infrastructure type thing, but it's more of a technology oriented. One guy if you're in Incose, you may know him, Ken Capture. He brought up the fact of GPS and how important it is for the United States and the world. and finance and everything else, because it also, in addition to being used, for where we are, it also provides time. And time is critical to so many aspects of what we do in information technology, as well as communications and everything else. So anyway, I can't remember quite, I was thinking about which one it would fall into, but fundamentally, some technical things are very, very important to us also. And of course, satellite failures based on the solar as well as the EMP, and obviously warfare, things like that could be very critically impact us too.
Well, these scenarios you're talking about are very familiar of us that lived through the Cold War. Even though there's more physical destruction, we're still talking about infrastructure destruction without being physically destroyed, but unusable.
Okay.
I'm not sure about some of your probabilities. I mean, consider that, for example, for the solar storm, the largest one in recent years was the 1989 one. That had a DST of negative 589 nanotesla, and what that caused was a failure at Quebec Hydro. But they had 88% of their capacity back online in, I believe it was 11 hours. Now, and remember, of course, that Quebec is at a much higher geomagnetic latitude than most of the United States, thus much more exposed to a solar storm. Mm-hmm. Coupling that with the fact that even the granddaddy of all solar storms, the so-called Carrington Event of 1859, I've seen newer estimates that say that even that was only some 900 nanotesla, and that clearly hasn't recurred. So I'm not entirely clear. I'm not comfortable with some of your probabilities. Now, I will grant you that for such high impact events, you want to reduce the probability to the minimum.
Have you had a chance yet to read the new National Space Weather Strategy and Action Plan that came out this last October yet?
No, I have not.
Okay. So that's something I had on the slide. You can get all of that. It's interesting because these are the kinds of questions that are raised. Now, as we resolve any one of these issues, by the way, you look at the collection of them and you realize that some of them can happen in combinations and so on. But just on the space weather one alone that you mentioned, it's sort of interesting. Have you had a chance to go to the space weather workshops that they hold in Boulder each year?
I haven't worked in space weather since since
okay.
the 1990s.
All right, that's okay. So I'm not one of I'm sort of like an 8-year-old boy with a raggedy toy, and I enjoy playing with my toys. But if I play nice with the other kids in the park who have nicer toys, it's a lot of fun. And I view all these guys with laboratories and like the Space Weather Prediction Center and people with multiple PhDs in space physics and so on as the other kids with nicer toys than I have. And so it's always fun for me to watch this dialogue go back and forth. So what's happening in the last 5 to 10 years in the utility industry, especially looking at the impacts of these things, you'll have people say the impact for a given range of threat is about this big. They'll say it's between a bread box and a freight train, right? And then somebody will say, but the next bigger storm is this big, right? And so they will argue amongst themselves as to what kind of engineering requirement should we have for infrastructure? Should we be ready for a small storm, a medium storm, or a larger storm? And when you watch these people go back and forth, you'll see that people will take different positions. We don't want to worry about that bigger storm. It's good enough if we just worry about this medium-sized storm or the smaller storm. So a lot of that information goes back and forth. You'll also see that when the space weather or utility engineers come together from around the world, you'll see that on one storm, the people in the northern hemisphere suffered relatively smaller problems. The people in South Africa lost a dozen transformers, and then they found out that the things that didn't die right away prematurely aged. the reinsurance industry has calculated that the small little storms that don't matter at all to us in this kind of conversation, doesn't drop down anything at all, results in $2 billion a year of premature requests for funding from insurance companies. So the reinsurance industry is beginning to say, if you don't do a better job with your engineering, we're going to stop paying for these things. So there's a lot of controversy about that. The other issue is there's a lot of research being done on the not only the effects of salt water, so they're concerned about people as far down as Florida when you have a larger storm that goes closer to the equator. Also, the type of rock formations you have and all that stuff will mean that you might have people at a similar place in latitude with a very different effect. So what you're saying is true, that there's certain things that a lot of people feel comfortable about, other things that are in sort of controversy because not everybody is in agreement. So the space weather strategy has also an action plan attached to it. There's 96 to 99 tasks that are being divvied up between NASA, NOAA, USGS, FEMA, and so on, as to what they must do to begin to talk with each other and move this problem down to a place where they can begin to resolve it. So there's going to be ongoing research. The bottom line of what's happening out of the White House has been they're playing sort of a referee role. And they're basically saying, okay, guys, you are just talking about smaller storms. Number one, we care about the ones that happen every 1 to 200 years. The guys in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they do 1,000-year planning horizons, not 100-year planning horizons. And we need to make certain that we are ready for the bigger storms. And that's one of the reasons they're doing this. And they're also saying, we know we don't have all the data we'd like to have, but we have enough data to start taking action now while we're trying to work on this. And then you can go across the other issues as well, like cyber's got similar arguments that happen amongst people who are experts in cyber. EMP a little less so because we can replicate that in the laboratory pretty well. And there's been a mini arms race in drive-by high-powered microwave weaponry and so on. So the EMP side, that's why I think the Defense Department came out with what they said. But I think you're right. There's a lot of fun things to engage as people on multiple sides of this issue continue to go down the path. But I think the Defense Department and the White House basically concluded that this is more serious than some people would think it is, and therefore we need to begin to take action on the stuff we know for sure while we're working out the stuff we're not sure about. I don't know if that's a good answer, but I'm just the 8-year-old boy with a raggedy toy, and I'm giving you my best feel of how the guys with nicer toys than I have all come together and sort of discuss these things. I'm going on to that meeting like that.
Yeah, one more quick comment about the insurance thing. The number that hit me was that they get if I understand it right, they did a 10-year study, one of the insurance companies or somebody, and they found a 50% correlation between the claims from the electric grid corporations and the solar storms.
The little bitty ones, yeah.
Yeah, and so maybe little things, but there's still claims that definitely correlated with the solar storms, and these are small ones, not the real big stuff. So
I think he's the last question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Mark and Chuck, for coming back again and talking about this. I really appreciate it. Also, it's a really obviously important problem to work, which leads me to my question, which is, it seems like a lot of the tasks and stuff that are being done by the working group and stuff, in creating artifacts, seem like more like system engineering tasks you would expect industry and academia and government labs to spend full-time paid workforces to do. And I would expect, the professional societies in general be focused on standards and maybe how to apply it and best practices. And yet it seems like you're almost like a working company creating artifacts. That is, can you explain why that is, or what's different? That seems like out of character of a professional society to do that.
Well, my impression right now is that, again, part of the reason for our CIPR working group is just to understand what the problem is and kind of go more towards that. And I have to admit, I get the same question as, obviously a lot of this work should have been done or has been done, and it's a matter of finding the details and get the right contacts to be able to get that information from them. So that's kind of the starting point, just make it aware that this is a real serious problem we need to understand. So anyhow, that's, but the problem that I understand it is like NERC, for example, they're the part of the problem rather than the solution. And maybe Chuck can answer that more than, whereas FERC is supposed to be controlling NERC, so anyway, you want to answer that a little more? You
Sure.
probably can do a better job on what's
Well,
going
to
on
avoid
there.
the politics between NERC and FERC and how much authority do they really have, that's a complex issue. But you're raising a fundamental issue, like why hasn't this already been worked on?
Right.
And when you peel back that onion, some pieces have been worked on a little bit, like some of the labs have been doing some of this modeling for some very sophisticated problems and put a lot of money into it. Well, I think the problem that we're observing in InfraGard is that a lot of our work has been stovepiped, and there's nobody responsible for everything. Same thing with best practices. So in any industry, you have regulations, you have standards, whether they're ANSI standards or fire protection standards and so on. But very seldom do you ever have somebody stepping way back and looking at how does this work in relationship to everything else that I normally don't look at when I'm doing this. And one of the things we're looking to do with InfraGard, where we could use your help, is the following. We just put together this triple threat tabletop exercise book, which is basically to say, how would your organization work through a 1, 3, or 12-month nationwide blackout due to any reason? We just picked 3 of them: space, weather, EMP, or EMP, space, weather, or cyber. This year, we're putting a planning resource book together, and we could use your help. And he knows how to get in touch with the people, even including from Hopkins here, who are working on it, which is to say, when you try to address this problem, it's bigger than what you're used to doing. So we want to put a resource book together, like a cookbook, to say, who do you talk to? How do you pull all the people together to work on this? And then the next thing we're going to try to do this next year would be to put a best practices book together, which is to say, how do we take multiple industries, multiple silos, and look at a best practice? Because you may not be able to regulate or put a standard together for something that is so cross-cutting all of those silos. And what would best practices look like in each of these areas when we take these kind of very large problems into consideration? And we would love to have your help looking at a cross-sector best practice approach. And that's, again, where your modeling is going to happen. And the big question then is why are we doing this as a bunch of volunteers? I think what happens is when we focus the light on these problems and get the top leaders of all these industry groups and all these government groups who care about this, we create some measure of consensus. Then we basically take a step towards that direction. And as we do, and other people begin to catch on, then resources will follow. So what we're doing as a ragtag bunch of volunteers, like in InfraGard and Incose today, could be something that would result in millions of dollars of work and should create multi-billion, multi-trillion-dollar industries and a more resilient society. But it's because people like yourselves take the first step before anybody's getting paid to do it, identify the problem, motivate other people to do something about it, and then take the responsibility to generate the resources rather than just wait for somebody else to figure it out. So we're basically saying we're aware of this problem. We feel personally responsible to making change happen long before any of us get paid. And we welcome your help so that more of us can do a better job at it, then create the resources so professional people can do the job as thoroughly as we know they should be doing. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer.
Thank you, Chuck and Mark. We're going to be drawing for the book now. Now I look at this. This actually is a book of going to create some nightmares because it says EMP, the escalating threat of an American catastrophe.
Catastrophic.
Catastrophe.
Catastrophe.
I don't know.
That's written sideways. It's a little hard to read.
I can read. I mean, so I think this is something that you can really read at night and have nightmares all night,
Well, just one quick comment about this week. That myself and the other two co-chairs we met a guy, Michael's his name, out in West Washington State. He gave us this book, and it's relatively short, not real big, but boy, it's got some very, very interesting aspects of what's going on, besides a checklist. So if you want to actually think about what do you need to recover from a power outage, a long-term power outage, is actually there's a checklist in the back. So
just if you want it yourself to get the nightmares, just type in Amazon and they'll get it for you.
Yeah.
So Mark, why don't you pull a ticket out?
Okay. Okay,